Good afternoon. My name is Liz Plater-Zyberk. I am charged with moderating a session in which the paper presenters have organized themselves, happily, to give you 15-minute presentations of the topics which are in your program. I have asked each person to do a small to give you a small description of themselves, a self-introduction. Some of them are academics, some are not, and then we will, once the presentations are done, we will open the floor to discussion. I like to do usually a small introduction about these research papers. Every year it seems as if there are more people in the room for these sessions. First of all, this year I believe Jaime Correa was charged with organizing and distributing for peer review. He's one of our faculty at the University of Miami, and so we're grateful to Jaime for doing that. Wesley, who's speaking first, reminded me that he's been at every one of these since we began some 6 years ago. And I don't remember whose initiative it was, but at one point we realized that much of the work that many members of the Congress were involved in could use the backup of research, data, and metrics, which was sometimes hard to come by. And like anything else, research could play a convincing role in the public realm, in public discussions, in policy changes, and really be quite powerful. At the University of Miami, where I have spent many years, we have a connection between the School of Architecture and the School of Medicine, the Department of Public Health, in which it was understood early on that the kind of data that was brought forward about smoking and health many years ago was very powerful in influencing public policy and, in fact, affecting a huge culture change in our country, and hopefully it will spread abroad. And so some of the research that people are doing related to the built environment has that same kind of ambition to really affect long-term culture change. Now, I should add that much of the research that you will hear in CNU sessions is not particularly funded. Research in the universities follows the money, like anything else, and funding sources for built environment research can be quite slim. So very often you'll see being presented work that people are doing because they believe in these things that they're working on and believe in the long-term benefit of producing this work, but it's not necessarily lucrative. It doesn't, because it's peer-reviewed, however, we can make some contribution through these kinds of sessions for tenure, that august convention that keeps people in universities and can help them continue a trajectory of research and bringing data and metrics to practice, to applying the research. So I'm just trying to give you a bit of a background about why these sessions are important, and hopefully they will grow over time and contribute to all the efforts that the rest of us are making. So Wesley Marshall will start, and then we'll just ask each one of you to come up in the order of your presentations, introduce yourselves, and be as efficient as possible. Thank you.
Hi everybody, Wes Marshall. I'm Assistant Professor, University of Colorado, Denver. Thanks all for coming. I might as well get right into what I'm going to talk about today. So, first thing, what do you daydream about when you think about new urbanist transportation? Again, don't tell me I'm the only one that does this. I can't be the only one that does something like this. But what do you picture? I mean, I picture something like this, and this is a picture out of our new street network guidelines. You see a lot of modes. Really, there's a lot of underlying principles that a lot of us tend to agree on, whether it's compact and connected street networks, narrow streets, location efficiency, a mix of uses, a diversity of modes. There's a lot of those basic things that go into what we're looking for. But in reality, in order to really get our new urbanist places built, we're making a lot of compromises. We're mixing our new urbanist ideals with conventional transportation engineering standards. And the question is, what do we end up with? Where does this bring us? Where do we end up in terms of what we're actually building? And really, we end up with a transportation system that has this disjoint. There's a disconnect between the different influences, and it creates some issues. And that's what I wanted to look more in depth today. So here's a quick picture of a T-intersection of two local roads. Do we really need to have turning lanes when we have two local, fully residential roads meeting? And apparently in this new urbanist community, we do. So that's the question I want to get to. What happens when we make these compromises? What happens when we build these places that possess these great qualities that we all think are worthy of putting in, but we're marginalizing them by prioritizing on mobility? And I think this is an important thing to do, because if we don't, we're not going to truly achieve what we're promising. And if we don't really achieve what we're promising, then new urbanism heads more towards a niche market as opposed to something that's really a better vision for a safer and more sustainable society. We need to get these like mode choice numbers. We need to get the safety implications. Like, we need to get these things to work right. So what I'm going to look at in this is Stapleton in Denver. I've been an assistant professor there for 3 years, so I figured I'd put my money where my mouth is and live in Stapleton. So I've been able to view this from a close-up. And for those that don't know Stapleton, it used to be an airport. This was, I think it was decommissioned in around 1995. And there's about where it is. The downtown, the CBD, is over to the left a little bit. So it's about 5 or 6 miles from downtown Denver. The new airport is a little bit further out. So it's really, I think it was, at the time, the biggest urban infill development in the country going on, because it was inside the city of Denver proper. And you can see here, this is what it used to look like in '93. It was an airport. You can actually see some planes if it was a little bit more focused for you. But and then it was decommissioned in '95, like I said. Construction started around 2002, 2003 was when people first started living there. So you can see houses and streets going in on the left bottom corner of the Stapleton area. And it really has grown exponentially, where 2007, 2011, now there's something like 12,000 people living just in Stapleton. Full build out in another 15 years or so, there should be 30,000 people living in this new development, which is like 4,500 acres total. So it's a big, big development. And that's what makes it an interesting thing to look at. So in putting together Stapleton and designing and coming up with the goals, the principles, the guidelines, they used what was called the Green Book. And it wasn't necessarily this Green Book that I think all familiar with. Stapleton came up with their own Green Book that had probably a better vision for what we all consider to be new urbanism. So in terms of a general approach to transportation land use, just here's one of the main principles they had. And if you read this, you can tell that they're thinking in the right terms. They're trying to head in the right direction. This is not a bad place to start with a lot of things. Looking at one of the more specific principles, here's one that has to do with street networks. And so they want to extend the surrounding street and block configuration into Stapleton. And here's a picture that I saw. This is from, I think, the early 1900s in Denver. And they were showing the extension of the downtown city block grid. And they wanted to show it heading far out of the city. So the idea was to expand this downtown grid system out into the surrounding areas. Did Stapleton do that? A little bit. We'll look a little bit closer at the street networks and what we have there now. You can see the shaded area is Stapleton, and here's a picture of the arterials going through Stapleton. There's the collector roads, and there you can see the local roads. And part of the reason for some of the less connectivity than you might expect is that there's a lot of parks going through Stapleton. So they are doing some things that we want to see in these places and adding components like that. But you can see, in terms of the way they use the functional classification system, the extreme influence of books like the Astro Green Book. So in terms of looking at what we ended up with, I wanted to compare some of the big picture things like the street network characteristics. So looking at street network density, it really wasn't too bad. And it was nowhere near the density of a place like Portland, but it was more like a place like Berkeley. It was along those lines in terms of the number of intersections per square mile. In terms of street connectivity, this is what you would expect to see with a fully connected network. A lot of our new urbanist communities are more like this. So we have these major roads and we have a little gridded block coming off the major road. So it's a gridded network, but it doesn't function like we have. And the interesting thing about Stapleton is it's a big enough development where you have multiple ones of these type things. So you have these main arterials going right through the neighborhood as opposed to being outside of the development, and that's the case in most of our smaller new urbanist type developments. And they don't function the same. They're very different in terms of what we do. So here's looking at Stapleton again, and you can see how many lanes there are on some of these roads going through. And if we look, in reality, there's only one road going east-west through Stapleton and one road going north-south. So what does that mean in terms of transportation planning? In the conventional methods we do planning, we plan for how much demand there's going to be on these roads. And then we try to allocate that in terms of capacity. So what do these roads end up looking like? Here's MLK Boulevard. This is the road that runs east-west. And you can see, 3 travel lanes and 2 turn lanes. And this is going right through the heart of Stapleton. Speed limit 35 miles an hour. This is probably a more typical cross-section for Martin Luther King. There's probably 2 lanes going in each direction. Each set of 2 lanes is 30 feet wide. And how fast are cars going on the street? And they're going pretty fast. So in looking at a lot of the speed data that I could collect, more than 18% of the cars are going faster than the speed limit. Another road here is Central Park Boulevard. This is the north-south thoroughfare going through Stapleton. So generally we have 2 11-foot lanes, bike lane, parking lane, and this is a parking lane that nobody tends to use, turning lane, and this is a speed limit of 30 miles an hour. Looking at, we've collected hundreds of cars going through here. 35% of the cars are going faster than 30 miles per hour. And of course, this has safety implications. This has cultural implications of what people see this place being like. And what ends up happening is we have these huge intersections where we have 4 or 6 lanes crossing each other. You can see that intersection in the top left takes up almost a city block. And that's how big this intersection is in the heart of Stapleton. Another one of the influences I looked at was these turning radii. So Denver requires a 30-foot curb radius. And if you look to see where the travel lanes are, they don't even consider the fact that on-street parking, bike lanes, things like that make the radius much bigger than we're really designing for. So the effective radius is really more like 70 feet. In reality, we should be using like 12 feet or 6 feet. I mean, that intersection should go up into the street a lot more. Another thing that Denver does is they require 25 feet clear on the local roads for some of the fire departments, and they have issues with how many, depending on the number of utilities in the street. I'm not sure how these roads got through, because there were a few roads that have this 30-foot cross-section with parking on both sides. And speed limit is 25 miles an hour. And with parking on one side, 55% of the cars are going faster than the speed limit. In the few places I found, like the street where I live on, with parking on both sides, only 3% of the cars are going faster than 25 miles an hour. A more typical local road and collector roads are these 38-foot cross-sections. And this is where on-street parking is allowed on both sides, but in reality, few people use it because almost every house there has a 2-car garage. Still 25-mile-an-hour speed limit, and 64% of these cars are going faster than 25 miles per hour on roads like this. Is that what we're looking for? Not exactly. And so if we have these networks that we want to make more connected, we need to combine them with streets that fit that. And you see these are the crashes that have happened in the Stapleton area over from 2003 to 2009. All the orange ones are all the injury crashes, and the red ones are fatal crashes. And these are just within Stapleton. And part of the result of that is the mode choice that we see in a place like Stapleton. So this is a map using the Front Range Travel Survey, which is a 12,000 household survey put together by our MPO, And the darker the color, the more people are walking, biking, and taking public transportation. So you can see Stapleton in the top right there is a very light color. So looking at the numbers, we have relatively low walking, not bad biking mode share to work. Transit's not too bad. Auto mode share is 92%. Comparing that with Lowry, which is another new urbanist development, very similar numbers, but they have a lot more walking there, similar in terms of the other ones. But in terms of our older, also mixed-use type neighborhoods where they did this study, auto mode share is far lower. Of course, there's a lot of mitigating factors that go into this, and Stapleton will be connected to the commuter rail someday, so there are things where I think this will improve, but it's not off to a good start. In reality, when looking around Stapleton, people use walking and biking as recreational. They don't use it for utilitarian transportation, and there's a big difference between that. People walk within Stapleton, but not so much outside of it. A lot of it because there's major roads surrounding it on all sides. So what is Denver doing? They do things like this. They added in this piece of a median to make the roads less connected. They add things like stop signs. Of course, that always work. I mean, there was a pregnant woman run over about a year and a half ago. And after this happened, she lost her baby. She survived, fortunately. There became a lot of interest in doing things and coming up with a better plan for Stapleton. So there were a lot of public meetings, and one of them I went to, an officer said this: that Central Park Boulevard is smooth, flat, wide open thoroughfare that's perfect for speeding. That's why they try to patrol it as much as they can. And the answer shouldn't be the patrol. They've posed us the problem right there. They should be fixing Central Park Boulevard and making it not that perfect thoroughfare for speeding. And Denver has a hard time because they only have 7 officers that full-time look at speeders, and that's a huge city for that sort of thing. So they do things like this. They put up these trailers. They've actually changed more of Martin Luther King Boulevard to 30 miles an hour, didn't change the design. You notice there on the right, a lot of that land is empty because nobody wants to live there. The thinking is when those things become residential or whatever they're going to be, it will help slow cars down, having things, but no one's building there because of these roads. Here's one of the intersections where we had see that big median there in the middle, and they tried to improve this by taking that out and putting a signal in. So it's hard to tell how big that area of asphalt is now, but it's huge. You can see where that median used to be, and now you're crossing 5 or 6 lanes instead of 4 lanes. So the reality is there's systematic issues, and really understanding these various influences and how the disjoint between them affects the outcomes is important. We need to have a better understanding of this. One little tidbit I'll share is I did an interview for NPR back in the fall and talking about these issues, and the author of the piece found this woman that lives in Stapleton, and she was talking about walking her kids to school and how much she would like to do that. And she lives there's the school, and she lives across Central Park Boulevard from it. So instead of walking the 8 blocks to the school, she actually walks 8 blocks the other way to put her kid on a bus to go to the school. If we're building, this is right in the heart of Stapleton, if we're building new urbanist developments that cause these problems, in some sense we're failing. This isn't what we're looking for. We need to do better than that. So that's the idea. I mean, we need to focus on a lot of these different influences, and when I told Dan Burden about some of these issues, his comment was we need to focus more on community and not capacity. I think that's a good way to start. Instead of really taking these different influences and just trying to get it built, we need to understand what's going to happen, and that's what this study was really trying to get to. On the other hand, we could do what this one gentleman did this is one of the local roads with a 38-foot cross-section. He parks his car on the right about 4 or 5 feet away from the curb. And then he parks this trailer on the left there, and he leaves it there all the time, and it says, drive like your kids live here. So he turns this 38-foot cross-section to something more like 24 or less by just leaving this there all the time. And he's told me he does this on purpose to slow cars down. And it works. So he's doing a lot better than maybe we're doing. And that's what I want to get across. So thanks for listening.
Good afternoon. My name's Paul Knight. I spent the last 10 years of my life happily at Georgia Tech studying architecture, city planning, and astrophysics. And now I am an intern architect and urban designer at Historical Concepts in Atlanta. So, let's see, let me find. So today I'm going to talk about the legal aspect of city planning and urban design. Now we all know that in the world of city planning, zoning is king, but we also realize that zoning is severely limited when it comes to creating good urbanism. So I'm here to help us rediscover this little thing called a master street plan, which originally was zoning's necessary partner in city planning. So in my paper I address these 4 questions, but given these severe time constraints, I'm only going to go over the first 2. So what is the legal definition of a comprehensive plan, and how has that changed over time? And what exactly is a master street plan? So the way we practice city planning today has its roots in the 1920s. This was a watershed decade for American planning law. And at the center of all the changes that were made were these 2 documents, the City Planning Enabling Act and the Standard State Zoning Enabling Act. Now I'm sure everyone in here is familiar with the Zoning Enabling Act because it gave us our zoning ordinances. But I'm also confident that not everyone is familiar with the City Planning Act. So what does the City Planning Act say about a comprehensive plan? Now I'm not going to read this whole thing, but it states that a comprehensive plan shall include, among other things, the general location, character, and extent of streets, viaducts, subways, bridges, waterways, waterfronts, boulevards, parkways, etc. And at the end of this list, they mention a zoning plan. Now, while there's a lot of stuff listed here, they can be fairly easily categorized into public ways, public buildings, public property, public utilities, and zoning. So just to make sure we're all on the same page, what is zoning? Well, the first sentence of the first page of the zoning primer, written in 1926, defines zoning as the application of common sense and fairness to the public regulations governing the use of private real estate. So zoning is the regulation of private property. So going back to our list, you see we have 2 broad terms we're dealing with. We're dealing with public property and we're dealing with private property. And if you read through these enabling acts, you realize that this is exactly what they were each handling. So the Zoning Enabling Act was handling the regulation of private property, and the City Planning Act was handling the location of public property. And each one of these acts has an associated physical map. So the Zoning Act has the zoning plan, and the City Planning Act has the master street plan. So the idea is that these 2 maps together comprise a comprehensive plan. But obviously that's not where we are today. We do not have a master street plan. We only have a zoning plan. Even though they tacked on zoning at the end of this list and even said that zoning is simply one phase of city planning. So what happened between 1920 and now? I'm only going to point out one thing because this isn't a history lesson, but in 1947, in Bishop versus Board of Zoning Appeals of the City of New Haven, comprehensive plan was redefined by the court to be a general plan to control and direct the use and development of property in a municipality or a large part of it by dividing it into districts according to the present potential use of the properties. So present and potential use of the properties. That sounds a lot like a land use map, and it is. So by this definition, the master street plan was dropped. You no longer needed a master street plan to have a comprehensive plan. This propelled the zoning plan to the status of comprehensive plan in and of itself. But furthermore, it combined the public and private components of the city into one map, into the land use map. And here we are today. This is a contemporary zoning map of Atlanta. And that black line in the middle is Interstate 85. Now notice that the right-of-way of Interstate 85 is zoned R4. So Interstate 85 in Atlanta is zoned residential, even though zoning is the regulation of private property. So it's moot for a city to zone itself. A city cannot apply police power upon itself, but they try to do it anyway. And unfortunately, this problem has made its way into the new urbanism, into the smart code, and into Miami 21. Now, don't get me wrong. Miami 21 is a great step forward. But if you look up the definition of civic, you'll find uses held in private or public ownership. So in casual conversation, It's fine to say that. You could argue that a privately owned restaurant serves a public purpose. But in legalese, you have to be extremely careful with how you splice these terms together. And notice on the zoning map, or the zoning atlas, these green areas here, these are civic zones. So civic zones. A great example of an oxymoron in city planning. Okay, public and private, keep that in mind. Okay, so here's the moment we've all been waiting for. What is a master street plan? This is a master street plan, probably the most famous example of a master street plan in history, the 1811 Commissioner's Plan of Manhattan, which shows the general location, character, and extent of streets. And that's all it shows. Nothing more, nothing less. But you can't build a city from this. This is showing the general intent of where they want these streets to go. So you have to survey it, which is what they did. So they produced hundreds of these surveyors' plats to project these future rights-of-way of Manhattan. So what are the components of a master street plan? Well, there are only two. There's private property, and there's public property. So private property and public property, where have we heard that before? Oh yes, our enabling acts. So these enabling acts were simply responding to the fact that our cities are composed of private property and public property. Okay, so I'm calling this a master street plan, but a keen eye will notice that there are actually no streets drawn. There are no curbs, no street trees, no parking stalls, only the delineation between private and public property. Only the boundaries are drawn. So it's essentially a master right-of-way plan. But the intention is that these rights-of-way will become streets in the future. Now, I know I'll be preaching to the choir here a little bit, but we all know that streets are important in terms of connectivity and walkability. But even more important than this, streets literally create property frontage. So they allow me to get to my front door. They allow me to go buy ice cream at the ice cream shop. They give a face to private property. So the more streets you have, the more access you have to your land resource. So here's a 60-foot right-of-way at 105th Street in New York. And here's a 60-foot right-of-way at 381st Avenue in Minnesota. Now, you would not be able to distinguish between these two on a master street plan. They would be drawn in the exact same way. But their differences only materialize through zoning and economy. So there's the other piece of the puzzle. Okay, so I'm going to fly through this. I compiled this data from the New York Times. This is showing what streets were constructed when in Manhattan. So in 1809, the streets at the bottom in red were existing. So as I go forward in time, you can see how the streets simply filled in the master street plan up to 1942. So that's 130 years for the master street plan of Manhattan to be realized. That is amazing. That's over political turmoil and the greatest migration of humans in history, yada, yada, yada. So this can only happen with the master street plan. Forget the connectivity index, forget intersection density, street grid density. Those do not work. I wrote a paper about that last year for CNU. You should look it up. You can only do this with the master street plan. It's the only way you can ensure up front walkability and all those things that we like. So imagine if Manhattan instead had been founded on a zoning plan. It's not that hard to imagine. This is exactly what would happen. When cities are founded on a zoning plan, they are basing their infrastructure on a variable. Land use is a variable. It changes constantly over time. But the master street plan is that constant framework of the city. So this is a near perfect analogy. Construction documents are to a skyscraper as a master street plan is to a city. As an architect or a banker or developer, I don't care what floor the lawyers rent from me. I don't care what floor the doctors end up. All I care about is creating a framework, a floor plate that can accommodate all of these uses over time. So the floor plate of the skyscraper is equivalent to the block in the city. The exact same block in Manhattan has accommodated wilderness, farms, houses, slum dwellings, and the Empire State Building. So yes, it's very important. Okay, maybe I've gone too quickly, but to summarize, cities are composed of public and private elements. That's it. So to reflect this fact, a truly comprehensive plan requires two physical maps, a master street plan to show the future location of public property and a zoning plan to regulate private property. A master street plan is a municipally established map. So it's established by the city. Don't confuse it with the developer's plat. I don't care if you have 1,000 acres. A master street plan encompasses the entire city. And furthermore, it is executed incrementally. So in the 1800s, Manhattan funded the master street plan itself and then passed that cost on to property owners. But in our time, developers develop streets and then cities come and condemn those streets. But it works just as well with that development methodology. So that's all I had to say. Thank you very much.
So, yes, welcome all. My name is Valentin Hadelich. I'm from Germany, and I teach at the Bauhaus University in Weimar. So, first of all, please excuse my English. It's probably I'm going to mess up words and use them in the wrong way. Maybe. I think the overall concept will be clear. I also work for a private institute in Darmstadt, which is close to Frankfurt, where we try to develop methods to assess urban qualities. Today I'm going to talk about the Venustas as the beauty, obviously. And after, let's say, participating on the Magic and Mystery Tour prior to this Congress, which I can really tell everybody is for next time to do so, it's very nice. We saw some of the it's too loud? No, not loud enough. Okay. So, everybody can hear me? We visited some of the great new urban developments in Florida, and I decided to put in the focus of this short presentation on two main aspects I believe are important in the discussion of the new urbanists. In fact, I want to focus on the question of beauty and of the context in which we build. So I will be starting by introducing the term of Venustas and how I understand it in the context of architecture and urban design. So obviously I think everybody more or less knows Vitruv and his trilogy of Firmitas, Utilitas and Venustas. And his idea of the equilibrium of the usefulness and the construction and the beauty and so on has determined like the architectural discourse from the Renaissance to up to the Carta of Athens, more or less. And obviously it still survived in some. Since then, a single-minded concentration on utilitas and firmitas has dominated the architectural discourse. If you try to define architectural quality through something other than function and form, we soon reach a point where we feel that there must be more, as Adorno put it. But really what this more is kind of difficult to define. I would like to introduce a concept of Venustas as something that everybody is aware of and is influenced by, but rarely features in the architectural discourse. And what I mean is Venustas as an atmosphere or as the atmosphere of beauty. So I'm just going to back one. This is a poem by Rilke. Very interesting is just these two lines that I emphasized there. For here, there is no place that does not see you. He's turning around the concept of himself seeing the statue, and he says, actually, the statue is influencing him, seeing him. You cannot go anywhere where this figure doesn't see you and influence you. This is the point where I'm starting. So I'm referencing the concept of atmospheric beauty formulated by Gernot Böhme. Gernot Böhme is a German philosopher, professor, and founder of the Institute for Practical Philosophy, which is very nice. Here, awareness is not a predicate of a beautiful object, but something emanating from it that attracts us and that heightens our own sense of well-being and of our quality of life. To use the words of Borges that we have here, the taste of the apple lies in the contact of the fruit with the palate, not in the fruit itself. So actually it's not the apple that is giving us the feeling of something beautiful and nice, but it's when we touch it, use it, eat it, whatever. And applied to architecture and urban design, this means that what is essential is the almost physical emotion, as he says, that accompanies the experience of an architectural space. This conceptual understanding of atmosphere means that it cannot be studied solely from the viewpoint of how it is experienced. In example, its subjective reception or so, but also from the point of view of how it is created. Consequently, not only the form of a building or the urban structure of a city is of relevance, but also the way the form influences the emotional and the mental state of its users. I just put in these pictures this morning because I thought everybody was talking about Europe as, you know, you don't have sprawl, you don't have problems. We actually do have also sprawl and the same problems we have here, so that's why this connection is so interesting for us too. So as part of my research, I propose a method of analysis that takes into consideration not only the geometrical form as represented and specified by materials, surfaces, rhythm, and so forth, or the function of the space itself, its purpose and use, but also the venustas, so the beauty of a space, that is to say, its atmospheric elements and beauty. So the production of atmospheres begins with the design of cities, parks, landscapes, and continues in design of commodity worlds, in department stores, or ambience bars of hotels, and so on. The atmospheric and functional impoverishment of the built environments has, as we have seen here, given rise to an increasing desire, actually, for authentic or for emotion tripping spaces. So I chose here the Campo in Siena during the horse race day they have twice a year, because it is actually a really good example of what Sloterdijk has called a dynamo for society. So people coming together in a public space, charging themselves, forming a community. This obviously is not possible if I try to meet here. So what spaces do we have to go to? So the fulfillment of this desire of a quality and of a narrative and emotional experience has been described as the aesthetic economics or economics of aesthetics, also by Gernot Böhme in his books. And this means that we left the phase in which we needed to buy stuff because we needed stuff, and entered a phase in which we pay the experience we have while buying the stuff we buy. So more and more people don't buy a house because it has a roof to protect us, but because we get emotions as a bonus. For example, a nice walk over the neighborhood, beautiful beachfronts, and so on and so forth. So the tricky part is that the experience we have is volatile, so we constantly have to come back to get a refill. So if I buy a pair of shoes in a nice shop in a nice street, I get the shoes, but I don't actually need the shoes. What I want is the experience I have buying the shoes. I have to go back, buy shoes or other stuff. So this is a kind of an economics that then develops these places. So this economics can be seen as one of the driving forces behind many of the urbanization efforts that you have seen taking place in the last decade, also in Europe. So the second aspect I want to focus on actually is the concept of context. The first context in which we act while talking about urban spaces like squares is the quarter and the city. So in the title of my paper, there actually is the definition of the venustas of urban squares. I didn't focus really actually then on the fact of a single square, of a couple of squares. I try to just also in the context of what I've heard so far and I've seen in the urbanist development, what is it and how we understand it. So we don't only talk about the direct context, like the city or the quarter, but also if we change scale and look at the functions and of the character of a specific space. And even when zooming further in and looking at the spatial configurations of objects forming this space, we'll be talking about the context and the context they create. So what we see here is actually a square kilometer of the city of Parma in Italy. I had the chance to study Parma for a year or so, working on my diploma, and based on the findings I got out of these studies, I developed these theories then with my professor and on work. So when assessing the atmospheric and overall quality of a square urban space, it is particularly interesting to note that certain spatial configurations have a similar positive or negative effect on their users. In the fields of perception, environmental, and aesthetic psychology in particular, much instructive research has been conducted into the effect of space and people. So, for example, the quality of a square in terms of its spatial structure is different to the qualities resulting from adjoining users or the functions to which the square itself is dedicated. What we see here on this picture is actually 3 times, so we have 3 squares, 3 different configurations that were digitally altered, and I think there were actually 5 different versions, and they then asked people which one do you like more. And in the end, they all more or less came together on the last 3 we see here, with kind of a medium complexity, medium height, medium closeness, and so on and so forth. So we could say that actually there is kind of an underlying understanding of what is good or bad or beautiful or not beautiful. So what I did is I went out to Parma and other cities in Germany and tried to look at the context of these squares. And starting from a set of indicators that I had worked up before, I went there, looked up if they were working, changed them, and so forth. So in the end, I had like 3 categories with 4 indicators that came together to define this, this assessment. It's maybe too much. I don't really know how to translate that method. They cover 3 different scales and all aspects in the life of a square, like the context of the square itself and its uses, and the spatial formation of the square. So at the macro scale, we have the indicators describing the integration of the square into the structure of the city and the quarter. At the mesoscale, its vitality and communicative potential, and at the micro scale, its spatial elements and their respective configurations and emotional impacts on the user. So each of these 3 scales of analysis has 4 quality indicators, as I said before. So to emphasize on how important I think the context is, many of the new urbanist projects we have seen also on the presentation so far, they have a certain size, and then we can look at them in a certain way, but usually what is around is just around. So what I have here is the definition of integration as the first category. For an urban space, we're probably part of a whole. It must be highly integrated on different levels with its close context, the quarter and the district. And what we see here is this square kilometer of Parma. I have signed all the squares they are. They come up to 140,000 square meter, which I think I translated in 1.2 million square foot. And the same square kilometer on Ludwigshafen and Speyer, which are 2 other cities, we can already see the difference we have. If we go and do this in somewhere around here, I'm sure we're getting like maybe 2,000 or 3,000 square feet, if even. So if we talk about the size of public squares, we don't only talk about the size of 1 or 2 squares, but also on the amount we have and where they are and how they are distributed and how they are connected. So the factors that have the biggest impact on the vitality of a square describe the elements that influence social interaction, the kind of ways in which the space is appropriated by its user. The key indicators here are outward focus, dialogue, character, and so on, which actually means the orientation of the plots, the houses, the entrances, functions on the ground floor. Is this an extroverted, introverted function? Is this a public or not, or private spaces? The spatial quality, which is, I think, maybe the most interesting and also the one that stays, even if function changes, the surrounding can change maybe, but the build form is the one that stayed. So coming from Lynch and how he understands or describes the city and how we can use it, I try to develop these three qualities, the centrality, directionality, and closure. So how focused is a square or a place, has that direction giving a certain tension, and how closed is it actually. So I'm not going to go into detail there because I think I'm talking too slow. So centrality, just some pictures, is created through the introduction of mass-built objects or point-like elements within the space. Then directionality, of course, objects pointing or walking lines, the size of a square, it has a direction or not. Repeating elements on facades and so on. Of course, these are just examples. I have a catalog with how this is done, and of course, there are many more possibilities. The enclosure is the same, so you can have really close squares like the Place des Vosges, or you have like squares that are open on one side, but then again hold through columns or views, nature, whatever, giving them this kind of closeness. So yesterday I did this 202 workshop, which was very great. I liked it a lot. And we walked through Clematis Street, West Palm Beach, and I took this picture. And in just maybe 2 last minutes, I want to focus on the context here and what it actually means here. So we have this nice portion of Clematis Street, but if we say the context is important, and I just go up a couple of meters and I look what is behind this one building that it's nice and this one street that is nice, it really lacks, thank you, any kind of context. So you have this one street, it could actually be any of these streets, there is nothing behind, and so on. So coming back to what we know or have maybe in Europe, we always feel like, okay, I have to stay here because if I go somewhere else, it's just going to be terrible. So the context here, for example, is Parma again. It's obviously a completely different one. So both spaces are beautiful in themselves. So I can look at the street there and this street there, and they're both beautiful. But if I take into consideration this other level, I realize that there is so much more that I actually need. So for example, this vista on the tower of this dome, is actually the thing that gives this place the special character it has. I know where to go, I see things, and so on. And while looking at the paper that were online, I realized that we were all talking about streets, which I find very funny and interesting. So I decided to take a thing we did and to take it here. So this is the same square kilometer of Ludwigshafen. And the red dots are all doors, like entrances into buildings. So we can see the sign circle there is a new development they're doing. On the one other side here, we have a river. So this could be a beachfront for Ludwigshafen, which would be obviously fantastic. So we just signed in these dots. Then we take the street network and we see they're connecting like the older part of the city to the river. There's a side, a beach walk and so on. Everything is fine. If we then overlay these two things and we connect them with a definition of a certain quality of this street, and I'm not talking about the width or how many lanes it has or something like this, but just taking, say, 25 meters between each door, and doors have to face the street. And then they take out the street that don't comply with a certain quality. We see that actually this new development is never going to be connected to what we had, and that the people living there will never go to this part of the town. They will go up to the old city center or wherever they'll go, but not there. So in the end, I have this very, very secret picture I took in a secret conference, secretly, obviously, and which is just giving us the formula of beauty in contemporary architecture. And this was where Ernesto Rattenet and Rogers, who brought this down 30 years ago. And it's obviously not even mathematical in any way correct, but I find it interesting that there is this strive for this formula. And so if anybody wants to take a picture there, this could be his future. In the end, I want to make maybe 2 points. First, it's all about the context, the complexity and the beauty of the context. And B, we should not try to fit everything into models, formulas, or whatever, because in the end, feelings and attitudes cannot be described completely in this way. So what we need maybe is come to life the moments we taste and experience things. So go out and feel the space. Thank you. Which one is yours? This one, right?
There we go. Yeah, thank you. I'm Gordon Brown. I'm principal of space analytics in Chicago. We used to be in Denver. In fact, about 15 years ago in Denver, we were one of the sponsors and helped organize CNU in Denver. So it's been that long since I've been to a CNU. In the meantime, Elizabeth asked for me to, each of us, I guess, to say a little bit in terms of self-introduction. I've had space analytics after I quit teaching at the University of Colorado almost 25 years ago. More recently, I've been out of the country. I was head of a large real estate program in the Netherlands, which is urbanism, very well defined as urbanism, new or old. After that, I was dean of a large business school in the Middle East. I've also been a fellow of the Urban Land Institute. Right now, I'm, as I have been for a while, member of the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors and chair of the Midwest chapter. So I get involved in architecture. I've got an architecture degree. I've got a real estate degree. I've got a business degree. I try to keep from being bored, and I hope I'm not boring anybody in the process. What I have to say today, first of all, I wanted to thank the previous speakers. Really interesting stuff. My only complaint about Valentin's presentation was that he showed a torso of Apollo, and he's talking about Venustus, and it should be Venus. So anyway, to go on from that, I want to talk about the first urbanism. And there are some really interesting things that constitute the assumptions that we make about streets. And I wanted to go back and think about these things and look into these things. And I'll just let you read this. I don't need to read it off to you. You can read. I think everybody here can read. Most new urbanists can read. I know architects can't read, but you're a new urbanist, and that makes a difference. And since this is a long story that I want to make short, and since we're really here in space, the final frontier, I don't think of it as a frontier. I think of it as a back tier. And this is one of the things that we have to think about. And I want to start off with this idea that's prevalent today in cognitive research about a dual systems account of thinking. These systems 1 and systems 2 have been, this has really come to be over about the past 5 to 10 years. And they materialize in 2 aspects of economics. Neoclassical or rational choice theory, the sort of thing Paul Samuelson has become famous in doing, and then behavioral economics, which is the work of Kahneman and Tversky over the past 15 to 20 years. Both of these, that's called prospect theory, interestingly. Prospect theory has shown, obviously, there's people like me and people who think about these things, that neoclassical economics is flawed. Now, I want to say something about these 2 things, neoclassical, and I want to talk about neoclassical thinking in a different way, and I want to talk about prospect ideas in a different way. And by doing that, I want to look at 3 phases of what I call 3 stages of human space. First one is evolutionary space. That space that began when we fell out of the trees like Newton's apple and started trying to walk around. We found a place where we could survive. And we found certain aspects of that place where we could survive. And we grew and we prospered. And then, after that, we moved to West Palm Beach. The key notion here is prospect and refuge. J. Stapleton proposed this, and I think it was 1976 his book came out. Probably a number of you are familiar with it. Obviously, prospect, an instance of unimpeded opportunity to see, certain spatial visual channels, and then refuge is an opportunity to hide. There's a development, a new urbanist development called Prospect on the edges of Boulder. Michael Chasey, an old friend of mine, actually came up with that term. This genetically prepared learning, System 1 learning, System 1 thinking is something that is extremely relevant to the way we make cities. Second phase is sedentary, what I call pre-urban space. This occurred around, well, between 10,000 and 8,000 before the current era. Basically, it's staying in one place. It's the beginning of the end of nomadism, the beginning of the end of hunting and gathering. It's the beginning of agriculture. It's the beginning of trade. It occurs, we find places where it occurs in near the Fertile Crescent, in Turkey, what's now Turkey, and what we see is that it involves property, communal property. So these earliest buildings, which emerged into permanent buildings, I mean, here on the left is an example. This is a Mountain compound in Africa, in West Africa. It's current. It's from current anthropological research, and it is very much like the kinds of compounds that existed thousands and thousands of years ago. The one on the right is Çatalhöyük, which is existed from about maybe 9,000, possibly up down to 6,000 BC. What you see there in both of these places, what you see is that there are no streets. There ain't no streets here. Streets didn't exist at this time. Streets were invented later. What we see is refuge. Now these little huts on the left, I mean, those huts are maybe 15, 18 feet. This is a small place. The one on the right, Çatalhöyük, eventually got to be a community of between 10 and 15,000. But the way people got around there in Çatalhöyük is by walking on roofs, climbing up ladders, walking on roofs, etc. Those were not streets. People say they're streets, but that's only a metaphor. It's not for real. What happened? 5,000 years ago, it became pretty clear that places like Çatalhöyük couldn't work. These are tribal societies. Basically, all these people are families. People live in these dwellings. You know, it's a lot like what you find in New Mexico. Yeah, they live there for might be 5, 10, 20 generations of the same family in that space. So you wind up with things like ancestor worship, the way the Romans had it, etc. So what happens is that alluvial farming develops. Some people start to do things. The division of labor occurs. People start to make money, whatever they call it back then. Wealth increases. People want wealth. They move. So people from other societies, other tribes start moving to these places that were doing great alluvial farming. What happens is that you start seeing people around who don't belong here. You go, oh, there's a stranger. Oh, that could be dangerous. Who knows? Is that well, anyway, we still feel the same way in a lot of public spaces. So what happened there was that communal property became very difficult to manage. This is the way these kinds of places were. 3000 BC, Mohenjo-Daro in the Indus Valley, not too much different from other places in the Fertile Crescent. We have these spatial channels that are created by buildings, and what they do is they allow prospect. You can see who's coming and going. You can see who comes out of a door. You can see who turns a corner. So urban space at that time, evolved because a new ruling structure, what happened was that these tribes, these people got together and said, we need to do something better. What we need is more security. We need to know what's happening in our town. And so communal property was split into private property and public property. And public property was streets. And streets enable prospect, and therefore societies can exist that are more complex than tribal agglomerations. So from that time, from the Fertile Crescent and the Indus Valley on, the majority of settlements worldwide have simple orthogonal patterns with rectangular cells, the buildings placed adjacent and perpendicular to rectilinear and deformed linear channels of streets. Why orthogonality? Well, that has something to do with the way we are. I mean, we are basically dominoes placed on end with a couple of legs that move us around. We're very different from horses and other animals like that. We have other characteristics that we find very interesting. Now let me shift to another story, 3 other phases. The moral design of American settlements. We know what this is. This is really a composite of a variety of towns that we know. I took it from, I can't think of the name of this book, but it's a planning book. This is Riverside in Chicago. This is a suburb of, or actually a part of suburban Denver. You recognize these differences pretty easily. I want to show here just simply about what's going on. This is something to do with connectivity and disconnectivity. The shortest paths from A to B, we see 2 paths with 2 turns, then 3 paths with 3 turns, then 1 path with 7 turns. Turns cost. So what we see as we move from left to right in these things is a disconnection of prospect from refuge. We see what's called path redundancy from information theory. And we have an increase in quotient transaction costs that result in externalities, the sort of things we have problems with today. We've been talking about property and space, and these things are, they overlap, but they're really not the same thing. And this, I could give a lot more examples, but this is some of it. And in terms of these differences, the thing that property does that space does not do is that it provides agency. You can't do a thing with space unless you own it. Whether you're a government, you can own it as a government, you can own it as a corporation, you can own it as a person. You really can't do anything with it, except deface it, I suppose. So spatial morphology does not really deal with property per se, even though it's dealing with property per se. And I wanted to just give an example of what happens when you don't deal with property. I'm sure some of you are familiar with space syntax. I used to be a managing director of space syntax. That was a long time ago, thankfully. There are certain claims made by space syntax, and they're based largely on this one, on this example. There's a variety of hamlets in the Vaucluse in southern France that are described in there. This is taken from the book, The Sociological Space. Certain notions associated with that. I wanted to compare that with, these are obviously taken, to me obviously taken from a French cadastral map, but let's look at a real French cadastral map with the real information on it. And the real information has, as we all know from cadastral maps, has property. So if you look at this thing with property lines, and those are the heavier lines are the hamlet's legal borders, and then we go back and we look, okay, let's compare this thing with property and look at what's really going on. Well, it's really a different kind of thing. If you really consider property, this whole theory falls apart. Completely falls apart. It's completely false. There cannot be any BD rings because actually what happens in all these things, people put up fences. It's become gentrified over the past 20 years. And people put up fences to keep other people out. So this flow of space is really minimized. I've been there several times. So anyway, to conclude, spatial morphology. It's really the channel. It's not the content. Parcels of real property are extensively coterminous with the architectonics of built form, something we fail to appreciate. Verbal instruction can be problematic. Learning things in university can be a real disservice to city form. Because System 1 can be overridden by System 2. And because people are complex, cities themselves need to be simple. That's something we have really missed, and I think some of the examples that we've heard earlier today say that. And because of collective real property, urban space continues to be evolutionary space by enabling the kind of creativity that cities have historically engaged in. Thank you.
Well, I must say, that was certainly an interesting group of papers. Quite unexpected. I was sitting here like the rest of the audience, wondering what was coming next. Perhaps we should just start with questions, because I think we've seen an incredible variety of new ways of thinking about space. Todd Zimmerman asked me to remind you that his session tomorrow is about time. But, and we're not long on time. So are there any questions from the audience first? First this one and then the next, your neighbor.
United Arab Emirates, but before that, Perth, Western Australia.
If you could just stand, it might be easier for everyone to hear you.
That better? In the Australian system, the streets are not coloured, they're white, as are the streams and rivers and so on. And if they are coloured, it's because they are reserved for acquisition. Once they're acquired, the next version, they become white again. So that's just that one point. We don't have the, what's the street master plan?
Master Street Plan?
Master street plan. And congratulations on introducing another three-letter acronym into our
MSP?
The MSP. What we discovered was that yes, when you lay out a town in a grid system, like say Adelaide, terminal like Adelaide plan, okay, yes, you can do it exactly as the commissioners did in Manhattan, because it's a grid and it just rolls out and ignores the countryside, etc., etc., etc. And we even have cases in Australia where we've got like a cliff and a 30, 40-foot drop, and there's a fence, and the road picks up at the bottom again, and the steps down for people, and that's it. So the practice now is that, yes, we have the zoning plan. Under the zoning plan, it's required that new areas have structure plans. This is Western Australia, have structure plans. And we work through those structure plans in a SID system. So it's corridor structure plan, or sub-regional structure plan, and district structure plan, and then local structure plan. At each level, sorting out the next level of infrastructure. So only railways and main roads and major trunk sewers and land to be preserved and so on in the higher level, and then coming down into the delta to the point where we have the...
Is this a question?
Now, it's not really a question.
This is really good information. I'm enjoying this.
Yeah, because I knew it would be. The point I wanted to make was, if we just go back to the old system, this is American practice, then you end up with a system that's encouraging laying out without regard to the interconnecting of all of those things we were talking about in that first workshop of repairing corridors and so on and so forth. So were you putting that all up and saying, let's go back to that, or do you have a prescription for how to amend the current system to fix it?
Well, just to stick with the Manhattan example, while they rolled out that grid all the way up to the end of the island, they did not accommodate the forthcoming Central Park. So that was just that was taken into account, I think, 50 years later. So they modified the master street plan to reflect that fact. But for the most part, the plan was pretty much on par with their original intention. So there is an opportunity to revive revise.
Yes. And it not, probably the grid was more a result of that period than a foregone conclusion about rolling out a plan. although many American cities have been gridded. I think many of the new urbanist examples are much more integrated to topography and so on. But that sounds like a good discussion. It'll carry on later. How about the next person?
And now, believe it or not, I understand. The question I have is more of a panel-type question. I mean, you were talking about, to use the terms that some of you use, Prospect-refuge, or public-private space. What seems like kind of a unifying thought between you, and I'd be interested in what you kind of had to say about the quasi-public space. Sort of, the big idea of the space with more extroverted content being sort of part of the transition, the nature of the quality of the interaction between the refuge and the prospect being kind of key to all your topics. And I just wondered, since we're inclined to divide everything, do you have any comments about how that integration goes and how that might enhance these theories or the way we understand moving forward?
That is a good panel question. Anyone could answer it.
I'll take a shot. I don't think we're inclined to divide everything. I think what we're inclined to do is to give some correct descriptions to things, and if they are different, to say that. The notion of quasi-public, I mean, this has been around now 40, 50 years or so, and it's open to diverse interpretation. And I think what we're trying to do is to move away from that kind of willfulness and really come down to saying, what are we really talking about here? What are these things? What really is quasi-public? What makes it quasi? And how quasi is it?
Well, and I remember being taught about semi-public and semi-private space. And I think in our, this will sound terribly cliched, but the difference between the front yard and the front porch and the house and the street may be about that gradation. There was a third question. Yes, Bruce.
It's kind of a question of Paul Knight, but also maybe others. How do you work out this procedure of subdividing according to a street plan if the morphology, when it's actually built out, tends to be like main street, then side street, then back street connecting? So, I mean, that's the historic way. And even when you showed Manhattan, you have these lines striking out, and then the side streets. It comes out as a grid. But really, you can think of Manhattan's grid as that same kind of front street, side street, back street thing, but with the back streets omitted. How do you work that into your thinking?
Well, in that case, in Manhattan's case, there are predominantly two types of rights-of-way. There's the really big rights-of-way and the smaller rights-of-way. So, I mean, obviously, the really big rights-of-way have become these large north to south thoroughfares, and the smaller ones have become the quieter streets that are less traveled. So I guess I'm not exactly sure how else to answer your question.
It may be determined by the geography, the spatial limits of the island, the fact that it is long and narrow. Sets up that.
Can I?
Yes.
Yeah. So I can answer later on the other one too. So if we look back at the history of how cities were founded, and there's a really great book by
Speaking for that.
there's a really great book from a German author, professor also, from Klaus Humpert, about the medieval cities and how they were founded and so on. And he shows actually how the street layout was laid out at a certain time and how this evolved, like avoiding backyard streets, for example. How do they call you?
Alleys.
Alleys.
Yeah.
Avoiding these alleys, because actually what you really need in a city that has kind of retail or whatever living, you really need as much ways to step onto the street or to have shops or whatever on the street as possible. So every street you do that has not that is actually just a waste. So in the beginning they were kind of having two ways to enter a lot from the front and from the back. Then they realized they were just using too much space up, and they just had these two lots coming together in the middle, having the street on both sides, and so having more streetscape or facade or whatever you say
Yeah, I think
to
you
sell
said
and
more
so on.
access.
Yeah, more access, exactly. And maybe just short for the semi-public third space, whatever thing. I think it's very interesting to look at that. And we were just doing a workshop just like 3-4 months ago in Tokyo, and I had this in my presentation like just one slide, and then the whole discussion was about third places and hotels and Starbucks and coffee and whatever. As one of the main really interesting, important spaces you have in cities for creative people and for people moving around or traveling and so on. It's in my system that I proposed, I have integrated this in the second category when you say about how introverted, how extroverted a function is. How much is somebody invited to get in, to use the space, to make it his own, like his private, or public, private, whatever configurations then are possible. So I think it's really about coming again together on all these scales. So, thanks.
We'll take a few more. We're running over, but I think this is a break time also. Yes.
This is a question for Wesley Marshall. Some of the problems that you identified have obvious identifiable solutions, right? The streets are too wide, you make them narrower, the curb rating, the intersection radii are too long, you put them shorter. What do you think accounts for and is the potential solution to the external connectivity issue? Because this grid on lollipop model that we see in so many of the greenfield developments, I think it's one of the new urbanism's biggest Achilles heels. And I keep hearing the sales pitch from some of us, including some of the founders, that these are seeds of urbanism around which beautiful crystals of urbanism are going to grow. And if we don't get the external connectivity right, it's kind of bullshit. So I'm kind of wondering how we solve that very big problem.
Well, Stapleton is a difficult case because being a former airport, the neighborhoods surrounding it weren't the best neighborhoods. So Stapleton almost strategically buffered all those neighborhoods with parks and open space. So there is very little external connectivity from Stapleton as compared to even other new urbanist places. But you bring up a good point, and that's, I think, got to be a place that we focus on, looking at opportunities to bringing more than just the one major street through, and building, neighborhoods that connect to the other neighborhoods as opposed to just the streets connecting to the other neighborhoods. It's more than just the streets being connected.
Yes.
Thank you. I have one question. I think one of the real big issues you have pointed out is the question of interconnectivity between spaces. And that was in many presentations. I think that is really a big problem you have. If you think, okay, do a center here, do a center here, no one thinks really about what's in between. And this is, I think, the problem with Stapleton. So what are you proposing to do about that? For example, we saw in these slides, Valentin, that there is like hundreds of plazas and spaces, and in between there's always something happening. But like in Stapleton, how comes a big street could be a center? Like, this is crazy, isn't it?
It probably should be. I mean, even that first street I showed, that it was only like 18% of the cars over the speed limit. And so I found multiple cars going over 70 miles per hour on that street. So it's a matter of, I mean, you see the problems and you think they're easy to fix, but you need to have more than just the community wanting to. There needs to be, I mean, political will to do these things. There needs to be, sort of a change in our thinking that what the street should be. I mean, because it's built for the cars, and the people that are walking and biking are just subsidiary to that. And it needs to be more than that, and it needs to be a whole-scale change. And, Denver is interesting because you see, I mean, people like when Peter Park was there, the planning department does a great great job with what they're doing, but it's the Public Works Department, the one that are actually implementing these plans, and they have a much different focus, and they're doing things very differently. So you need to integrate even those departments in order to come up with the streets that we think we deserve.
You know, I might add to that by saying we almost crossed an interesting threshold in Miami 21, and actually the critique of civic space, whether it's that it's in the zoning now and it's not really the public property, is something that caused no end of difficulty. The neighbors' attitude towards public property, whether it's schools or it used to be called government in the prior code, and the fact that that people want zoning on it, you know, some kind of controls, but at the same time, all the issues that were raised here theoretically were being played out very practically. So I found this very interesting that you pointed to that. But one of the issues, I'm sorry, I got off track, but you brought up, can you remind me?
Connectivity between two centers. Anyone looks at these centers, a lot of what's between them, how you can link them.
And I'll have to come back to my thought, I'm sorry. Yes, Peter.
I'm sorry, it's not a question. I was the planning director in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and in Denver. And it's interesting, these presentations for me were terrific. All
Yeah,
of them.
fabulous.
The discussion about the master street plan is a really important one. In Milwaukee, there was the official map. Right? So folks call them paper streets, but the starting point from the public side was that we have a street system laid out. If you want to change it, then that's a discussion, but at least that's a reference point. In Denver, the Stapleton issue is that there isn't an official map. When I first came to Denver, as a planning director, I said, where's the official map? And folks were like, what are you talking about? So, but this does argue, I think, for these larger connectivity questions and challenges actually can't be addressed at a project level. They have to be addressed at a city planning level. And so thank you for reminding everybody of the master street.
So we're, one more question.
Just to kind of follow up on what the gentleman right there just said, in Manhattan Master Street Plan, I used to live in Philadelphia, and there's famously William Penn laid that out through a grid similarly in a very walkable, very livable city. It's a pleasure to live there. And I think it was because of that. I wasn't really conscious of it, but I experienced that, and I can see where that comes from. And then Stapleton, like the gentleman here was saying, was there any effort to lay out a grid and create the city, like a town center and a livable walk?
Yeah, there's a master plan.
Yeah, there's definitely a master plan. I think they think it did. I mean, they had a master plan. They have one town center built. They have another one coming soon. They have a Northfield development.
I would point to what Peter just said, the difference between planning and public works. And so that, in fact, is where I was going with the Miami 21 thing. We were on the verge of having the streets included in the zoning code, which is really taking this completely in the opposite, to the opposite extreme, in order for them to be something that the public would have some say about. Because actually Public Works gets to put in the streets that its standards require or that the engineers believe in, and no one can exert any influence over that. Or that's what we've been dealing with all along in the new urbanism up to now. So the streets were approved by the Public Works Department, and then they realized they'd have to go to public hearings if they ever wanted to do a street that wasn't in the code, and so they were pulled out. But I would close this session and invite you to come up and speak to our speakers with one kind of overarching comment, and that is that this subdivision between public and private property, which I have not seen ever explained quite in the various ways that you all did today, and the kind of private appropriation of the wrong public design, I thought that was a great one, is really, in the end, the most powerful thing you can do. Because once that division is made, it's actually very hard. It's difficult for the private sector to somehow take over a public street. It does happen. They close alleys, they close streets, but that's a difficult thing to do. And the public sector doesn't have a lot of money to go around buying pieces of private property to change the street grid. So you can imagine in Stapleton, if somebody were to say right now, hey, you know, these big streets don't work, we better put in 3 more north, south, east, west streets to increase the connectivity so we can narrow these streets. There are people already living in those neighborhoods, and they will actively prevent that from happening. If they had figured that out early and could modify the plan before the private property became multiple owners, then there would be hope. The Via Appia still exists in Italy, and I think it just reminds us how important this kind of first act, the streets plan, is, and what a disservice it was for our society to turn around and say, we'll just let the private sector do it. And so many of our cities' metropolitan expansion is really burdened with rural areas that have been chopped up in many different ways without any hope for future connectivity. In the Sun Belt, there are some areas where the public sector mandated the mile and the half-mile connection. That's a Miami-Dade County law. The mile connection was put on the mile grid, on the Jeffersonian grid. The half mile was up to the developers, but at least there is that. And this is going to be, this is one of the, will be probably one of the major problems of sprawl repair, is how do you overcome that lack of public connectivity in the midst of multiple property ownership. So thank you all for giving us really a lot of food for thought.